I'm Dave Croto, professor of New Testament and Greek at Columbia International University and dean of the seminary, and I am joined today by two very distinguished gentlemen, Dr. Steve Johnson, who's professor of counseling and president of the prestigious Albert Ellis Institute, and Dr. Seth Scott, professor of counseling and elder at Radius Church. So there has been some talk in the last year and a half about the concept that empathy is sin. And I wanted to bring you guys in and just have a little dialogue, let you guys dialogue about this idea. Dr. Johnson, when you hear the phrase empathy is sin, how do you respond to that?
Amazement that anybody would come to that position. And keep in mind, I tend to take a very scientific view, and we just have so much research studies, meta-analysis of multiple studies that specifically show the value of empathy in helping to make change in another human being.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And Dr. Scott, when you hear that, you hear what Dr. Johnson's saying, how are you responding to this concept?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's so much in the counseling literature, in the progression of relationship that we've seen on what makes counseling effective and how it is that aspect of relationship through working with the client to demonstrate that you're there with them, you see them, and you understand their perspective, to be able to expand their perspective in some way, but that you see them, you hear what they're saying, and you understand it.
Okay, so in digging into this issue, it seems like some of what's going on may have to do with the definitions and concepts that are being discussed here. So what are some getting on the table, some definitional terms? Where should we start with that?
I like to put it in a broader perspective because I think there's a category of attitudes and with emotions attached to them that are connected to sympathy and empathy, all the way from pity to sympathy, empathy, all the way up to compassion, right? And there's a progression there of how much engagement the individual has in perspective taking and actual feeling what the other person feels. So I guess what I would look at when I'm looking at empathy and sympathy is to say these are umbrella terms. They're rather abstract. And what we need to look at is what are the components of each of those things. Otherwise, we're just throwing around abstractions, and missing each other in terms of understanding what we're talking about.
Okay.
So what do we see as happening really between these terms as we shift? It's not necessarily this stage piece where we go from sympathy and then hardline gear into empathy and then into compassion, but that they flow into each other and shift kind of back and forth in understanding how these things work. So how would you kind of frame the difference between those?
Yeah, and kind of hinted at it, I think in terms of engagement, like pity would be having this, experiencing distress because the other person is experiencing distress. Right. Sympathy would be a bit more emotional distance in that process, not the full kind of sharing in the perspective or not sharing in the emotional response. Sharing doesn't mean accepting and embracing totally. It is understanding, right? With the caveat that maybe we'll get to a little bit later. Empathy, I think, is much more about really getting in and understanding the perspective to the degree that we can, understanding the person's perspective and their emotional response. And then compassion is that I suffer along with their suffering.
Okay. Yeah. So with empathy, there is you can never fully get into the person's feelings. You can't feel exactly what they feel. That's never going to happen. But you can try. It's the attempt to try to get close to grasp that, right? And then compassion. Is there an action component related to that?
Yes, I mean we see in Scripture regularly that Jesus is interacting with people, and we see the text says, Jesus was moved with compassion, and he did something. Mm-hmm. And so it's this progression through seeing what is happening, having a neurological, biological, emotional response to that situation, and then from a gospel framework, driving a intentional response to do something in action. So the neurological, biological piece.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating because we can do research on what happens when someone exhibits empathy. I mean, to the degree we can ask a client, did you experience that therapist is having empathy or not? That's about the best that we do. We can't control for it because it would be grossly unethical for us to say, I'm going to treat this person with empathy and this one not with empathy. We would not get approval of doing that kind of research. But put that aside. I think neurologically, we've known for a number of years when we've done the research, especially called common factors research, about what works with clients, is that what is termed empathy, if the client attributes the therapist as having empathy, they're much more likely to change for the better toward goals in all kinds of domains, personal, professional, educational, spiritual. So we see great change for the better with that. A little bit more about science. Now we know that it's actually built into our biology, our neurobiology. Just jargony here, there's a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. It has these things not only there, but these mirror neurons are there in other places too. And those mirror neurons are so fascinating that if somebody is suffering, we have an emotional response that lights up that same part of the brain that they have. And so in some degree, we are sharing in their emotional response.
So there is scientific evidence about not exactly feeling the same thing, but getting close to actually feeling what they're feeling, experiencing what they're experiencing, and we can see it in the brain.
And we can see it in the brain, right.
Interesting.
And so the error in the assumption that says sin is empathy is this assumption that in feeling with someone else, you lose all sense of self, all sense of perspective, or capacity to maintain even groundedness in your own sense of authority, of perspective, of cognition. And it's an oversimplification of these differences between kind of cognition, behavior, and emotion, is that we don't shift wholly into just emotion and lose all sense of capacity for cognition, is that it's this continuously multiplicity of influence between those factors and others to help us recognize that I see and understand and feel with you through the mirror neurons that are activating a similar emotional response, but also through my own experience, which then informs how I view you, how I view the world, how I view the situation. So while there are, we can get lost in the other person's perspective at times, the assumption that empathy is only ever being lost in the other person's perspective is an overgeneralization and is, most of the time an inaccuracy in understanding what that is.
So empathy does not mean you're getting lost in their emotions, though that can happen.
Yes.
So is there another word that describes what that is?
Yeah, I mean, from the family systems model, we would call it, enmeshment or fusion, where we lose the capacity really even to have our own unique identity, perspective, and emotional response. And across the board, we would say that, well, that's not healthy. It's not healthy to completely lose yourself, or codependence would be another term, right? All of these terms of instability of self in relationship to another person.
This kind of reminds me of like the method actors, where you can have someone who's like studying a certain way a person behaves, like they're obsessive compulsive, and then they get into the acting role, and the next thing you know, they actually are manifesting it in their personal lives. Is that kind of the mistake? Like, you can study someone, you can grasp it, you can get there, but then there is a point where you go too far, the enmeshment, the codependency, those kinds of things. Is that a good analogy?
It's a difference between acting as if and thinking that it is, right? So we're acting, I think that's part of perspective taking. We know what the situation was. We know the inference they make about it. We're trying to understand their beliefs and what their action would be associated. We try to get into that. For me, perspective is just too broad, right?
Right.
What are the components of perspective taking? And then we can get into that. Unless you've got very leaky boundaries anyway, we can do that without realizing that I'm not Batman or the Joker, right? Yeah.
And the concern with this issue goes beyond just the fact that if you view empathy as a sin, then you don't express empathy, and then you come across as hardened, narcissistic, emotionally detached. So there's that concern of it, but there's also a theological implication in how we view what God has called us to do and be in relationship with others and representing His image to the world, as well as the recognition that through the incarnation, Christ represents in his functional process of becoming human, becoming flesh, how we can actually maintain the correct roles and understanding of empathy, is that Christ came and was fully human, but he maintained his capacity and was fully God. And so while he entered into our world, our estate, he didn't lose sight, capacity, rationality, or perspective from what his Father called him to do and his mission in us. And as counselors, as people, as followers of Christ, we're called to that same thing of walking with someone, entering into their situation, but bringing an aspect of God's perspective to that. And those things aren't necessarily in opposition to one another. We struggle, and we're never going to do it as well as Christ did it, in maintaining grace and truth and holding both of those things in perfect unity and tension. But we are called to work towards that.
So the incarnation is a model for us to follow. We'll never totally achieve it, but it is a model for us to follow.
Yeah, and I would argue that it is, and that it's demonstrated through this shift of sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And while the term empathy isn't used in Scripture because it's a more recently developed term, it would be kind of anachronistic to insert this term into Scripture. It is definitely, the concept of philosophy is definitely represented in how Christ interacts in the New Testament.
Do you think Jesus had empathy for people?
I think Jesus frequently shifted along that continuum from sympathy, empathy to compassion in a regular response. And the fact that, even with Mary and Martha in John 11 is, he gets there, and it's always I always memorized that verse because it was the shortest. So if I got in trouble and had to say a verse, it was John 11:35, Jesus wept. But we see, and it's kind of strange, well, why is he weeping? What is happening? But he's engaged, and he has the capacity. He's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. And so his emotional response is even greater beyond what Mary and Martha are experiencing in loss. It's the fact of death itself, I think, that he is responding to. But he's joining with them in their sorrow, in the experience of this loss. And the fact that he's able to do this demonstrates that his mirror neurons are operating. He is human. Mm-hmm. But because of that, Mary and Martha understand that he loves them. And that's the function of empathy. It's this necessary relational component that says, to say I love you and I care about you, but then to demonstrate it in our joining with them in their emotional experience. And we aren't going to have the capacity like Jesus to necessarily do something about it every time. But in Jesus' compassion, he raised Lazarus from the dead. Most of us are going to have to just sit there with Mary and Martha and, like they anticipated, hope for the resurrection.
Mm-hmm. And cry with them.
And cry with them.
Cry with them.
Yeah.
Dr. Johnson, would you say that sympathy is more objective than empathy?
Absolutely not. I think to be empathic is wonderful because it helps us to be have authentic subjectivity, and for that authentic subjectivity to be objective because of those mirror neurons that we're talking about, right? Because I have, to some degree, the same part of the brain's lighting up that you do when you're experiencing an emotion allows me to experience the same emotion and even act in some ways that you do, or at least have the propensity to act in that way, that my emotional response helps me to be objective about how you are experiencing something. So lacking that really kind of puts us at a deficiency if that happens. For example, research shows that if your mirror neurons are lit up and mine are too, then that really helps the relationship. But there are particular people, we call it psychopathy, like psychopaths, when they experience somebody, their mirror neurons are lighting up, theirs don't, right? So there is clearly a deficiency in that individual that doesn't allow them to be objective. They're only acting as if. We're going beyond acting as if because we're participating in their experience. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, among people that, would be quick to label things sin in counseling, right? Jay Adams is kind of the hallmark to say that he established this hard line of making sure that we address the Bible and how we deal with people. And interestingly, his response, I can read his response to you. This is from Heath Lambert's book on the biblical counseling movement. And he's citing in the appendix Jay Adams' response to some critiques within the movement, and cites Jay Adams as addressing this issue and saying that sympathy for others is not enough. A biblical sort of empathy is necessary. In it, the counselor enters into the counselee's problem in such a way that the counselor sees more deeply than his counselee. He reaches so deeply that he not only sees and feels the dimension of the problem as his counselee does, but beyond that, he sees God's solution to it. So I'd argue that there's somewhat semantics in how we're addressing this, but we see even someone like Jay Adams acknowledging that sympathy is this stance away, this looking apart, whereas empathy is required to join in with the client, in with the person, to be able to even have a means of relationship to provide perspective and solution and direction for them. If you don't join in with them, you haven't really earned the right, the relational credit to be able to provide perspective. Otherwise, you're just kind of Monday morning quarterbacking it on them and saying from a distant stance of like, well, you need to stop doing that or not do that. It is that the relational credit we gain through sympathy that allows us to provide care and support and direction from an objective perspective that we hold.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And in fact, if empathy isn't there, right, and person wants to have emotional distance, you know what? I understand that, because that can be scary to move in. And we often will think, oh man, am I adequate to do that? Could I hold up? What if I make a mistake? All of those very legitimate and human kinds of thoughts, they make sense, they're there, they're not helpful, right? What's helpful is to take that risk in hope and in trust that everything will be okay, ultimately, right? That's hopeful, to embrace empathy, right? And if we don't, I think we're really severely limited to the degree to which we can help others.
Dr. Scott, the people that are talking about empathy as sin, they're pointing out a danger of something. What is the danger they're trying to point out? How would you word that? And then, is it a legitimate danger that they're trying to address?
Yeah, I think their concern is the assumption or the reality in our culture that we affirm everything that a person is experiencing and don't have really the capacity to interject an objective perspective or issue. And so it's this tension between accepting and loving someone and needing to feel like then that also equals that you're affirming every choice that they're making. And so empathy is this ability to accept and to love someone without necessarily affirming the rightness of their choice. And so existential humanism, which is kind of the world that we live in and in the world of counseling really in the 21st century, does have this value neutral stance of assuming that whatever the client says is right for themselves should be affirmed and valued. And so I think they are rightly reacting against that, but I think they're wrongly associating empathy as if it is only the ability to fully jump in with 2 feet to their experience without being able to maintain kind of rational detachment in some way or perspective to be able to provide care and support.
Okay. So as you're talking, it reminds me of the phrase that Paul uses, speaking the truth in love. And as I'm processing this, it's like if you have love for somebody, maybe it's a little easier to get to empathy for them, but that doesn't mean you still don't speak the truth to them. Am I on track with that?
I think some people would believe if you have empathy and you're sharing a perspective, that we're just going to affirm everything. At first, I don't use the word affirm anymore. I will say I acknowledge what they're going through, and because of empathy, I can have a very strong hypothesis about what the emotions, etc., will be, because I will be sharing to some degree those. But that doesn't take away, like, a common question that we would use, and how is thinking that way helping you, right? What are you getting out of that? So that doesn't mean that we're not challenging, but we're challenging in love, and we're doing that in a way that we hope maximizes that they will change in every domain of their life, even even the spiritual way. And I think we have a duty to help them change in ways that we know maximize the possibility of that.
Gentlemen, I've learned so much from you today. I greatly appreciate the time you've taken to address this issue, and I'm sure many people who are watching this will learn as well. Thank you.